Welcome back to our series on cognitive distortions, where we explore different distortions and how we can challenge them. If you're new here or just need a quick refresher, a cognitive distortion is a pattern of thinking that is skewed or unrealistic or unhelpful or irrational that tends to lead to negative thoughts and or negative emotions. So today we'll be looking at one such example of this, and it will be overgeneralizations. I think this is a very common and well-known type of distortion, so we probably don't need to spend too much time explaining it, but nonetheless, without further ado, let's get into it. So what is an overgeneralization? An overgeneralization is a single event that it falsely becomes foundation to a larger perceived pattern. It incorrectly concludes that all similar events moving forward will result in the same experience, right? So because something happened one time and I had this experience one time, it means that all following experiences will be the same. So some examples of this might include stereotypes, isms, internalization, and being closed-minded. And I'll explain what each of these things mean. So a stereotype is basically an assumption that we make about someone based upon some attribute or characteristic that that person has. So it may be things like their skin color, or what type of clothes they're wearing, or what type of political party they affiliate with, or what type of religion they may follow, right? And we take this one thing about themselves and we create an entire identity for that person based upon what we think someone who shares that attribute would be like, right? That is essentially what a stereotype is, right? So all black people are like this. All Christians are like this. All fill in the blank are like this, right? That is a stereotype. And that is an example of an overgeneralization. Isms, right? Sexism, racism, classism, right? All those things are, again, examples of a perverted form of overgeneralizations, right? I'm making assumptions about who you are as a person based upon the color of your skin. I'm making assumptions about who you are as a person and your character based upon your social class, right? I don't actually know you as a person, but I'm going to make assumptions about who you are as a person because of these characteristics, right? These isms, if you will. They are examples of overgeneralizations. Internalization. What do I mean by that? It's when you take something that is external to you and you apply it to yourself, to your inward person, hence internalization. So for example, let's say my girlfriend broke up with me, right? So this external event of being broken up with may lead to this internalization or this overgeneralization of no one will ever love me, I will forever be alone, right? This single event of someone breaking up with me is now leading to this overgeneralization of no one will ever love me, right? And that leads to me then feeling as if I will always be alone and that I will never be loved, right? So it's this overgeneralization that's now being turned inward into internalization. So another example is being closed-minded. What do I mean by that? If I believe this overgeneralization to be true, then I close myself off to any other possibility, any other permutation, if you will, right? So, for example, if I believe that all black people are Democrats, well, what happens when I meet a black person who is Republican, or who is libertarian, or who is independent, right? What then does that say about my belief? Well, if your first response is, well, that person must not really be black, right? Because all black people are like this, and if you're not like this, then you must not really be black. That is an overgeneralization and an example of being closed-minded. You're not allowing new information or new evidence to inform your way of thinking. You're closing yourself off to any other type of possibility. That's just another way that overgeneralizations may manifest themselves. Okay, so how can we challenge this way of thinking? So we have to understand that there can be different outcomes or permutations despite shared features, right? So not all black people think the same and act the same, live the way, have the same experience. Not all Christians live the same and have the same lifestyle and experience. Not all these people have the same this, right? Different, we might share the same features, but it doesn't mean that we share the exact same thoughts and the exact same experience, right? There can be different possible outcomes, different possible manifestations, even though they have a shared feature, right? So that's one way to kind of break free from overgeneralizations, is recognizing that it's not a monolith, right? There can be variety, there can be diversity within a group. It doesn't have to be all a monolith. Identify evidence to suggest it will not always be the case, right? So just because something may happen one time doesn't mean that that will always be the case. Just because you met one person this way doesn't mean that all people will be that way, right? So find evidence to suggest that just because it happened this one time doesn't mean that that will always be the case. Just because this was true in this instance doesn't mean that it will be true for all cases, right? So identify evidence to suggest that that will not always be the case. Reflect on whether this single event is indicative of an immutable pattern, right? Obviously, as humans, we love to try to find patterns because it makes our lives easier. If I can denote a pattern, I can then shape my way of thinking around this pattern. But not all instances lead to this pattern. Some things might just be unique instances that may have occurred, edge cases, whatever the case may be. So again, how do I identify whether or not this is a pattern or just a one-off? If it's a legitimate pattern, then great. But if it's not, then let me not then apply it in this overgeneralizing way as if it is. And then lastly, replace words like always or never or other overly broad language with more accurate or realistic ones, right? I think I mentioned this before in a previous video, but these kind of absolute words or this very broad language most of the time isn't always the most accurate or realistic, right? Things don't always go this way. Things don't never happen that way, right? There usually is some level of gray or nuance in between, right? There are exceptions as well. So being able to be more precise with your language and not use these overly broad or absolute terms will also kind of break out of falling into an overgeneralization. All right, so now let's look at some examples of a thought that we can then reframe from an overgeneralization to one that might be a bit more realistic and helpful. I failed this exam. I feel like such a failure. I will definitely fail all the other exams. So there's two things we need to look for in this, right? The first thing, of course, is what is the single event that occurred? And the second thing is what is the assumption or the pattern or the thing that is being projected, right? So in this case, the one event that happened was the failed exam, right? And the pattern or perceived pattern here is that I will definitely fail all other exams, right? So what we have to challenge here is, just because I failed one exam, does that then mean that I will definitely fail all the other ones? So a reframed thought might be, I didn't pass this one exam, but I can review and relearn what I missed, study the material, and prepare for the following one. I can do better next time. So we see here that we've identified the thing, the single event. I did not pass this one exam, but now we're exploring the evidence to suggest, will this thing be something that will always happen, or is it something that can be changed, right? So in this case, I can change the outcome by reviewing the material, relearning what I may have missed, studying the material again, and preparing for the next exam. And by doing so, I can then change or do better next time, right? This one event is not indicative of all other events. I don't have to overgeneralize in that regard. I can understand that there can be special or individual cases. They don't all have to match or have the same outcome. And of course, although I am a therapist, I'm not your therapist. So if you are looking for mental health services, please reach out to a mental health clinician in your area who can personally help you along your mental health and wellness journey. And as always, all the best.